We appreciate it. And I really want to thank both Chet and Brian. They traveled a long way and flew in on the chance of hopefully not getting stuck somewhere along the way. So appreciate y'all making your way down from D.C. As y'all know, there is a whole lot going on in the petrochemical industry, both on the oil and gas side and the chemical manufacturing side. So we're very delighted to have Chet Thompson with AFPM and Brian Zubwalt representing the American Chemistry Council here to talk a little bit about some of the opportunities and challenges that are before us. One of the first things that we wanted to touch on was kind of talking a little bit about the outlook that we foresee for the petrochemical, for the refining, and for the chemical manufacturing side of things. So Chet, I'm going to start with you and ask you to tell us a little bit about what you see on the forefront for the refining industry.
Okay, can you guys hear me? First of all, let me, Hector and everyone, thank you for inviting me today. It was an honor. It is an honor to be here. It's the first time I've ever flown into a tropical storm to give a talk. Let's hope, let's see, I hear the airport's closed, so we'll see. I might be here for a couple days. And I know acronyms have been thrown at everyone, but let me take the opportunity just to say the AFPM is the American Fuel and Petrochemical Manufacturers. We're a trade association located in Washington, D.C. that represents the, as the name implies, the U.S. refining industry and the petrochemical industry. From a membership perspective, we represent about 98% of the refining capacity in the country, so really about everybody. On the refining side, we represent 121 of the 130, give or take, U.S. refineries. And we're basically eyes, ears, and voice in Washington on everything refining and petchem. But as to your question, I would say, you know, the outlook right now, I mean, always I start off with the optimistic outlook. Like Ryan, the previous speaker, said, we have to be optimistic. We choose to be optimistic. But I have the great pleasure of representing the most efficient and effective refining sector in all the world. We certainly are the envy of the rest of the world. I would say from how are we doing this year, it's a mixed bag, as you know. Certainly not as good as some of the other years. Refining margins are down off of last year. Capacity's down a little bit, but we still have a lot of good things to be excited about. We still have gasoline demand in the north of 144 billion gallons. We have a robust diesel demand. And the thing that I think gets us most excited is the fact that exports, U.S. refining, of refined products continues to grow. We're approaching about 6 million barrels a day, and that's where the growth is. We're going to find ourselves being the refiners to other segments of the world, Latin America, to be sure, parts of Africa. And so I think we have a bright future ahead.
Let me ask the question. We had the recent drone attack in Saudi Arabia that the president expressed concerns that may impact our production here. I know that there was even suggestion of using some strategic reserves. What has transpired since the attack, and what is the sense from your members as to the impact it's going to have to supply?
Well, it was certainly a complicated weekend once the news report of the attack at APK, became, public. Certainly there was a jolt to our industry that with the possibility of losing 5 million barrels a day, substantial supplies. And what it was doing was adding greater pressure on losing yet another source of heavy crude. As you know, that heavy crude has been challenged with limited supplies over the years from Venezuela, reduction in supplies coming out of Mexico, and Canadian crude being locked in. So a number of our refineries, Marathon, PBF, to name two that pop to mind, that rely a lot on Saudi crude, and that was a real concern. And you saw that reflected on Monday in the stock market, what crude oil prices did. They went up. Refining stocks went down. The good news is we've seen that reversed a bit over the last couple of days as the reports out of the Saudi has been that perhaps they're going to be able to get fully back online a lot faster than the initial report suggested.
Excellent. That's good news. Brian, shifting over to chemical production, what do you anticipate is the path forward?
Yeah, thanks. One thing I want to mention before I get started on this, I know that Chad introduced me as being with the Grocery Manufacturers Association, and Hector introduced me as being with the American Chemistry Council. And so up to about a month and a half ago, I ran the Federal Affairs shop for the American Chemistry Council. I had the pleasure of being here and participating in this event last year. Moved over to the Grocery Manufacturers Association about a month and a half ago. So I think it's fair that I can caveat anything that I say is wrong by about a month and a half. And so if I'm off on anything I share here, my apologies. But I think it still remains exciting times putting on the American Chemistry Council hat for a bit. The industry is very excited about the opportunities and investment here in the United States over about a 10-year window, and I think this is looking back to about 2-3 years ago and going forward to the next 7. We anticipated investment in the United States of about $235 billion and about 305 new and expansion projects across the United States. And if you look at Department of Commerce numbers, the chemical industry represented a full, I think it was 49 and 50 or 50 and 51% of all manufacturing investment in the United States over the previous 2 years. And so I think there's still a lot of excitement. Most of it has to do with the low cost of natural gas and the competitive advantage that gives us to produce chemicals here versus the rest of the world. But it's going to be interesting to see kind of these regulatory challenges, and you heard some about what the economy may do. But I think generally speaking, there's a lot of excitement, and that investment's, as far as I know, most of it's planning on going forward.
Excellent.
Can I just add one thing
please.
to that? And I echo everything Brian just said and what Ron Korn said a few speakers back. And the best, most brightest outlook of all this is the growing middle class, global middle class, and the fact that over the next few years there's going to be a couple billion additional people across the planet that are in the middle class. And why do we care about that? It's because they're demanding all the products that we now take for granted here, but other parts of the world do not. And certainly that's going to continue to drive demand for petrochemical.
Yeah, and we've talked about in the past that what's happening in a lot of the developing nations is they're starting to see the level of consumerism that the U.S. experienced in the 1950s. And clearly a lot of the products coming out of the petrochemical sector are providing end products that are going elsewhere outside of the United States. So that's important. Much has been said around trade policy. Obviously, I think the president has been very determined to try to get some balance in trade. The unfortunate side of that is it has had some impacts on the industries we represent. So I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about the impact directly to the refining and petrochemical industry, and put on your pundit hats and give us some thoughts on how you see this playing out over the next year to 2 years.
Well, I'll let the numbers, I'm sure Chet knows kind of the numbers a little bit better than I do, but getting back to that investment we see here in the United States, a significant portion of that was anticipated to feed the world's market, to be exported product exported across outside of the United States. The numbers, if I recall correctly, we had about a $35 billion trade surplus in the chemical industry, and over the next 5 years, we anticipated that number to double. I honestly am not a trade expert, and I'm not going to pretend to be a trade expert, but the vast majority of the fight that you see the chemical industry focused on Capitol Hill right now, separate of some of the regulatory issues we're talking about, is the trade front and what we're having to deal with the Trump administration. There's big concerns with what's going on with China. I think there's a sense that the president has dug in, and who can blink first, that's going to be a protracted battle with China. Whether or not the trade agreements can get done and what's going to happen with USMCA in the fall is going to be very interesting. There's some additional political dynamics playing in there that I can discuss a little later when we get that. But in terms of the specific numbers and impact, I think Chet's probably more informed than I am.
Well, this is what I'll say, and I say this a lot living in Washington, is, we have a lot to be excited about. None of it should be taken for granted, and the things that can mess up our growth are things that folks in Washington, D.C. are doing right now. Regulatory obstacles, legislative obstacles, and trade obstacles. And we're really outspoken in Washington on our fear and concerns on the trade front. We certainly support the Trump administration on a lot of things. When he was elected, his policies, frankly, on energy was like someone stepping off our chest, right? And he's done a lot of good things. But one thing we certainly don't support are certain of these trade battles. So particularly with the tariff war with China, that has had enormous ramifications for folks in this room and the industry on the Gulf Coast. And I would say the interesting thing is most of industry in Washington is united around this, that we need to resolve this on with China. But the one thing the president has remained consistent on is this issue, because he's not consistent on everything every day. But as far as it relates to China, he's been more consistent on it. Now, me crystal balling this, I think this is one of the things that the president controls. He controls his own fate here. And I believe that sometime between now and we get into full election cycle, he will solve this issue. He can solve it. He knows the importance. I certainly don't think he wants to solve this problem, prematurely. But and I'm not necessarily in the majority opinions on this, but I cannot see the president going into next year's election year with China looming large like this. Now, on the other front, there's another part of the trade that we need to talk about, and that is, USMCA, NAFTA 2.0, and that's critically important as well to the U.S. refining and petchem industries. We, as a refining sector, we get 40% of all of the crude we import comes from Canada, and somewhere between 20 and 25% of all refined products we make go to Mexico. We need free and open borders between Canada, United States, and Mexico. This is also, probably goes without saying, a big political fight at the moment. And the president is trying to work with Nancy Pelosi because she controls whether or not this issue goes to the House floor for a vote. My instincts are that this will get voted on and that USMCA will pass. The fear we have is that if it doesn't appear that it's going the president's way, does he threaten and then perhaps follow through with prematurely pulling out of NAFTA without having a USMCA deal to take its place, and that wouldn't be good for anybody.
Absolutely. And, you mentioned the elections coming up. I do believe this will be an election issue. It's a little surprising that in the Democratic debates, they have not made more of this as a wedge issue when they're criticizing the president. They're certainly criticizing about many things, but this doesn't seem to be catching fire the way one would expect. Thoughts on that?
This is just a tricky issue to navigate, and I don't think the Democrats have figured out a way exactly how to deal with the pushback on China. It's a universal populist issue. How do we deal with China? And it's just a very difficult issue to navigate. On top of it, you have the USMCA component where I think the administration has done a fairly good job in terms of aligning the unions. And when you have the union support, that also makes things a little bit difficult for the Democrats to position themselves. And so it's going to be interesting how it plays out, but I just think it's a tricky issue to navigate. Trump's in for lack of a better way to describe it, when they can't attack him on it, he's kind of in a good spot on the issue.
And Chet, you brought up regulatory issues are also a big challenge for industry. Let's talk about some of those. What are some of the top regulatory issues that you feel are impacting the business of oil and gas and chemistry?
Well, what we call it the regulatory swamp. Let me just start at the beginning or midway through the story. A couple years ago, certainly we were drowning in overregulation in Washington. And I used to talk with my CEOs and ask them, what they feared the most. And almost to a CEO, they would say they didn't fear the competition, they didn't fear foreign competition, but what they needed to change was the regulatory structure, just overregulation. And I would say, it's gotten better, but we run the risk of sliding backwards. I mean, this election will have consequences. But I would say from a refining sector, number one regulation that dogs us is something called the Renewable Fuel Standard. That is the requirement that requires the refining industry to blend a certain amount of ethanol into gasoline every year. And over the years, that ramp has been going up, and that has become more and more difficult to the refining industry, particularly smaller U.S. refineries. This is a difficult political topic because it divides the Republican caucus. So this isn't whether you're Republican or Democrat. This tends to be whether you're in corn country or you're in refining country. This issue is very timely. In fact, Senator Cruz is leading a delegation into the White House today to talk about the RFS. And again, the issue is whether the farmers in the Midwest want the president to add more of an ethanol mandate, and certainly we're trying to oppose that. CAFE standards are big. That's the standard that sets fuel gas mileage for the United States fleet. The standard that President Obama left us with, it goes far beyond how far a car needs to get on a gallon of gasoline. It actually was a hidden mandate for electric vehicles. And so if you look at the CAFE standards as on the books today, the autos will tell you it actually would require about 40% of all cars to be sold going forward to be electric. And as you can imagine what that would do to the gasoline supply. So, we're fighting for standards that are more realistic, that keep consumer choice at the forefront. Folks and bureaucrats in Washington certainly shouldn't be deciding what kind of car you drive, and that's what's happening now with these mandates. Subsidies for electric cars, huge issue. 90% of all the subsidies go to families making $100,000 or more, and over 50% of those subsidies go to the people living in California. So I would say those issues, transportation policy, fuel supply issues are big. And then, and I'll leave some room for Brian, but certainly the infrastructure and the difficulty of getting any kind of projects, particularly midstream projects, done has become just a drag on the economy, and we need to get that fixed.
Before we go to you, Brian, I want to remind our audience that if you have a question that you'd like to throw out, please don't forget to use the feed so that you can send us some questions as well. But Brian, what are some of the regulatory challenges you see there?
Yeah, I'm going to first put on my chemistry council hat and then switch to the GMA hat. But from a chemical council perspective, and in building off of what Chet shared, I think it's fair to describe, it's absolutely fair to describe the Trump administration as really kind of a blessing to industry in terms of what they're doing on the regulatory rollback front and what they're trying to free up as it relates to some of the additional regulations, particularly at EPA and the work they're doing there. I would say they're a burden in the sense that what we've seen as a result of the federal regulatory rollback is at the state level, particularly on the east and west coast, they are in an unbelievable aggressive campaign to more or less deal with what they view as kind of the missing component of regulation and the lack of trust and credibility in what the Trump administration is doing. And it is creating very much a mess. I mean, when we were looking at budgeting for 2020 at ACC at our last board meeting, everybody was focused on how do we put more money in the states. What we're having to deal with, everything from specific chemical issues like PFAS to styrofoam cups to plastic straws. I mean, I was at the Dallas airport, and when I sat down for breakfast this morning, they had a ban on plastic straws at the restaurant I was at. If that's kind of the situation where you're losing those battles in Texas, I think it gives you a good sense about how these regulatory fights have moved to the state level. I would also note, then going to the GMA, putting the GMA hat on, the consumers are really starting to become a significant regulator in terms of the forward-facing, consumer-facing products. I have a hard time believing that, and Chet knows, once we're done with this PFAS battle and some of these other big chemical battles that we're having, they don't resonate downstream, and it puts the consumer packaged goods industry that's having to deal with some of these issues, plastic waste being another one, having to address and financially deal with the burden that's coming from what's happening at the state level and the consumer level from kind of, I would say it was kind of a response to what the Trump administration is doing.
Yeah, and the one thing I would add is you talked about the states, but it's also driving down to the local level. We're seeing a lot of local municipalities trying to regulate policy at that level, and I think it's driven by an organized effort. You talked about plastic waste, and that's a pretty good segue. Talk about sustainability, and I know that both your organizations have been proactive in trying to address sustainability. It's important to the companies we represent. Tell us a little bit about some of the priorities y'all are looking at in the horizon around sustainability.
Well, let me just start. And, the way our industry and our trade association talk about this is, and a lot of this in the context of two of the biggest issues, challenges that are out there, certainly climate change, and we can get into that and what that means for the refining side, and then the plastic waste side of the, for the petchem. But we talk about a mission at AFPM that we have to meet the dual challenge. And what's the dual challenge? And that is to continue to supply the fuel and petrochemicals that are life, that we all thrive on. And we have to continue to deliver those goods, but we have to do it in an environmentally sustainable way. We have to. Politicians expect it, but more importantly, consumers expect it, as Brian said. And so, we certainly strive to do that, and we are trying to find programs that continue to reduce our emissions, both within the plant and outside the plant. One of the things that AFPM has been working on with our members over the last couple of years is exploring higher octane fuels that allow the internal combustion engine to become more efficient, that will reduce emissions. Certainly our wastes are down. Our emissions are down by 95+% over the last couple of days. We have a pretty good story to tell. We just have to do a better job telling it.
Brian?
Yeah, I'd say what part of my learning curve going into, again, a consumer-facing industry and a consumer-facing organization is the focus on sustainability is maybe priority one. When I was in the chemical industry, it was an important issue, and it was something that we were working through. The Alliance to End Plastic Waste, I think, was discussed earlier. But really what it means for the downstream users, or the downstream, I guess, industries, in particular, as people talk about plastic waste. But really what the consumer sees when they see a plastic bottle on the ocean, it has a Coke stamp on it, or it has a Pepsi stamp on it, or I think our industry is even more sensitive and is going to be quicker to respond to some of those forward-facing issues because the consumer wants to see the results from us. And we're going to, again, how it's going to impact recycling in America and how we deal with plastic waste in America and really writ large across the world. Sustainability is going to be priority one for the downstream component. It's going to be interesting to see how it impacts.
Let me add one more thing about that, because the one downside of sustainability discussions recently is that they have been narrowly focused on just environmental issues. And certainly from a sustainability standpoint, if folks in this room know, it's broader than that. It's making sure we attract and educate a strong workforce, and it's inclusion, and it's certainly environmental. It's innovation. It's continuing to innovate products. And we explore this all the time with our member companies, is what are the types of things across the full suite of operations do we have to do to ensure that we're thriving 20 years from now?
And to mention, Brian brought up the Alliance for End Plastic Waste is an industry-driven commitment to try to end plastic waste by the year 2040. And that's a very daunting challenge. And the only way we can do that is by coming up with new innovative strategies to improve recycling, to make materials, consumer products, a lot more recyclable, and to provide better education to consumers, not just in the U.S., but around the world, to make sure that they understand how they need to manage waste and hopefully improve recycling capabilities. We've got just about 5 minutes left, and I was going to want to switch over to something that's a little more fun and talk a little bit more about the elections and politics, because I think folks in the audience have a lot of interest in that. One thing, to tee that up, I want to talk about, you both mentioned how the Trump administration has really made some important changes regulatorily that have created some progress for industry and have freed up some opportunities to be able to launch the growth that we've seen in industry over the last several years. Let's talk a little bit more about what the impact of the upcoming election and what's at stake here for the industries we represent.
Wow, I guess that's fun. Look, it's a scary time, and AFPM, we don't endorse presidential candidates, but I will tell you, right, that it's hard to watch the political debates that are happening right now and not be a bit nervous on one side of the choice spectrum, right? We have every major Democratic candidate for president has endorsed some form of the Green New Deal, which, to the extent it has any parameters around it, all of them have been to eliminate the use of fossil fuels, right? That's pretty scary for those in this room and for this part of the country. Even the self-proclaimed moderate of the group, Biden, has said that he would like to see the end of use of fossil fuels during his presidency. But he might forget saying that. But we will remind him of that. And so that's scary, right? And so I don't think any other industry has it like we have it at the moment. And so we have to, you know, what we're doing is trying to communicate. We have to communicate. Ryan had mentioned what is the biggest challenge we have, and he said it's fear. Well, I think it's, frankly, we have to make, there's not, outside of region of PAD 3, outside of the Gulf Coast, there's just a lot of people in the world today, in our country, who have no idea where their stuff come from. They don't know that everything from their phones to their clothes to their, you name it, comes from fossil fuels in our industry. We have to do a better job communicating that. The fact that we're actually debating whether we're going to end the use of fossil fuels in the next 10 years in this country is pretty astonishing. So you can imagine what that means if the Democrats take over the presidency. It's going to mean some pretty challenging times for us. So we stay tuned.
Especially considering the fact that we've just really achieved energy independence, both from a natural gas standpoint, domestic natural gas, and obviously now we are a net exporter of refined product. I mean, so it's really, I think, heightens what you just said, Chet, of the impact it'll have.
Yeah, I hate to do this, but I'll just have to be careful because there are, you know, as in North America, we're more energy independent than we have been historically. But just to be clear, the United States, we're still not energy independent. And I say this because we have had to remind those in the administration. You know, we still get 40% of the crude that goes into our refineries every day are foreign crudes, and because our refineries are geared to, you know, to refine, you know, the heavier stuff. So I say that because that's how important USMCA is as well.
So since we got a minute and a half left, I'll say this. If I were a betting man, 90% chance Democrats retain the House, no matter who the Democratic nominee is. I think the Republicans are in a difficult position in the Senate right now. Fortunately, I think for some of the more vulnerable Republicans that are up, that'd be Cory Gardner from Colorado, the Maine case, Susan Collins in Maine, even Tillis in North Carolina. The Democrats have been so far unable to bring some top talent candidates up against them. So it's be interesting to see how those play out. I think they're like, the Republicans have a 3-vote margin in the Senate right now, two or 3%. I should know this off the top of my head. Margin in the Senate. But if you see Republicans end up losing the Senate and you see a Democrat come in control of the White House, I think it's going to be a fundamentally different world, particularly as it relates to these regulatory, sustainability, even tax, how potentially a carbon tax comes into play in these debates going forward. I think it's going to be a fundamentally different world that people are going to be working through.
Sure. We did get a question in here, and I think it's one that may be right up your alley, Brian, in your new role, but the impact of the food industry on climate change. Thoughts on that?
So again, I've been in this job for 1 month. I will tell you this. We have been focused directly on the sustainability issue, and in particular, one of the things we're looking at right now is supply chains and how supply chains could be made more efficient and potentially reducing carbon emissions. In terms of the overall number, I couldn't even guess. Honestly, I've been in the job a month, and so I've got a lot to learn, but in this universe, in particular on the sustainability component, it's one of the key areas we're focused and one of our pillar issues going forward.
We'll have to bring you back next year and have you answer that question for us.
Can I just add before that, as someone who often is blamed for climate change, I like that. I think it is the food industry's fault.
Fair enough. I cannot thank y'all enough for taking the time and effort to get down here, as you said, flying into a tropical storm, to be here. I think it speaks volumes about what these organizations think about the Economic Alliance and the industries that are represented here today. So let's give our panelists a big round of applause. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.